spare, fighting the Taliban. Harry confesses that he was at times believing that he was missing out on the real war. He felt that the real war was down the valley. He could see the explosions in and around a place called Garmsir. And then he wondered, for instance, were Sandy and Tiggy working for the Taliban? And then he explains that a Taliban recruit would fire at them, and they return fire with 20 times the force, and anybody that survived that would then be promoted and sent to fight in one of the larger cities, like Gereshk or Lashkargah, which some people call Las Vegas. He explained that many of them didn't survive, and the Taliban just left their bodies to rot out on the battlefield. Harry was pleading to go and do something. He wanted to get closer to the front. Finally, on Christmas Eve 2007, his request was approved, and he was to replace an outgoing FAC at Forward Operating Base Delhi, which was inside an abandoned Garmsir school. He then describes what it was like, and also that there was a company of Gurkhas based there, which, as you probably know from other material, is who it said was posted essentially to protect Harry. He then speaks about the history of the Gurkhas and explains to them that, oddly enough, at Sandhurst, the Gurkhas always play the enemy in military exercises, which was a bit strange because they were always so beloved. And they had a solemn reverence, it would appear, for royalty. In their minds, apparently, that a king was divine, and a prince wasn't too far off that divinity by virtue of being relatively close to being a king. And he explained that they all bowed to him, called him Saab. And he said, no, just call me Lieutenant Wales. But they wouldn't do so. None of them would allow him to go off on his own. And he said that, he might be going off to the mess or the toilet, and he'd suddenly have an escort. And he said that he adored them, as did the local Afghans, who sold them chickens and goats. And he said that when they weren't following him around, they were intent on fattening him up. And on one occasion, somebody brought back a goat, which was a Christmas present for the Gurkhas, and brought it in a net, which was hanging from a helicopter. He then also explained that out of the helicopter appeared somebody that he recognised who'd worked for his father for a few years. And he explained that this gentleman who's called Bevan appeared to be rather attached to the goat. And one of the Gurkhas came along and chopped off its head. And that the Bevan was disappointed, to put it mildly. He then talks about what some of the gifts of the knives that he had received from the Gurkhas in the past, and he was also invited for him to basically slaughter the goat, but he declined because he didn't want to miscalculate and cause it to suffer, and therefore the Gurkha did the job for him. He explained that his job at Delhi was similar to the one at Dwyer, only the hours were different, and it was constant. At Delhi, he was on call day and night. He talks about the ops room and what that was like, and then he was criticised for doing something wrong, and that he was marked out as being new. And that there was a chap whose call sign was Magic, and he explained that he would pass an entire night chatting to him, and apparently they liked to talk and laugh and eat, and apparently one evening they were feasting on fresh crabs with his crew up in the air. And then he invited Harry to look into his screen and explained that from 20,000 feet his view of the curvature of the earth was astonishing. And then he turned his camera, and a screen filled with breasts. It was a porn magazine. He explained some of the pilots were women, and she's talking about how gorgeous the moon is, and then all of a sudden he was having the piss taken out of him because he was having a conversation with this female pilot and was told to go and get a room. And then he explained that the work that he did with this particular pilot, and then asking to what could be seen. There was something called the pattern of life, and it all added up to it being Taliban, and therefore a strike was to be planned for the next day. And he was working it out with 2 American pilots and the ordnance that they were going to drop upon it. And usually, if it was Taliban fighters, the standard request would be to drop a 500-pound bomb. But apparently, Harry didn't think this was enough to penetrate the fortified bunkers that he was seeing on his screen. And therefore, it was a case of getting a 2,000-pound bomb to drop. And the Americans didn't see any need for that and decided that they wanted a 500-pound bomb instead. He wanted to argue about it, but didn't feel that he had the confidence to do so. And then he watched as they dropped the bombs on the target and heard that it was a direct hit, Delta Hotel. And then Taliban came running out of the trench, and then the bombing and shooting of them continued. And he then told himself that a bigger bomb should have been dropped in the first place, and that the next time he would listen to his instinct in that regard. He then explains that he got a sort of promotion to a small lookout high above the battlefield, and that the Taliban had been trying to bring down the lookout, and they were firing their AK-47s. And there was a Javelin missile unleashed from the direction of where Harry was by the Gurkhas that were with him. And he was told to jump on and climb into the gun nest, grab the big handles, shoved in his earplugs and took aim. He squeezed the trigger, and he describes what that was like. And it was the first time he'd fired a 50 caliber weapon. And he describes what it was like, and the mayhem of the guns firing, etc. He explains that he was asked how many he killed, and the response was that he couldn't be sure. The answer was that it was indeterminate. And then he explains that he was then moved, this time to Forward Operating Base Edinburgh, and he hid amongst the mail bags in a Chinook in order to hide. And then he was roomed with an Estonian signals officer who he got along with very well. And he explained in the distance was a town that had once been a Taliban fortress, but in 2006 the Allies had seized it. And it was some of the worst fighting that British soldiers had seen in half a century. About 1,000 Taliban had been subdued. He then moves on to explaining that he went on patrol with scimitar tanks from Forward Operating Base Edinburgh, and describes coming upon an IED. Explained how it was dealt with, and then in the distance he saw the poppy fields. Then he continues that they went deeper into the desert, and they made a square of their vehicles, which they call a harbour, and they went down to show presence and to continue to do patrols around the town. And he explained that on one day there were some shepherds near them. They were making the Americans nervous, and that the Americans fired several warning shots, and they hit one of the shepherds who'd been riding a motorbike, and it wasn't sure whether it was an accident or deliberate. And when they went out, they went and retrieved his motorbike, and the Taliban guy who'd been bandaged up and released was shocked that they'd retrieved his motorbike for him and that they cleaned it. And Harry explains that he'd more or less passed out when they returned it to him. No mention of dealing too much about the press, and again recalling some of the activity that he was engaged in Afghanistan. No mentions, of course, of being in a bunker, no mention of any Xbox. So make of that what you will. Are those just rumours, Or is that the actuality and something that Harry isn't going to mention? Or perhaps it's something that comes later in the book. But he gives you certainly a taste of what he was experiencing. And what comes through again is that he felt a sense of purpose in all of this. That when he's directed to do something practical and that something is hands-on, he very much feels alive. Something, of course, which once again I mentioned, we don't see in him these days. Next up, there's a trap. Let's find out what that involves in the next video.